And hello, fabulous AP students. This is your favorite teacher, Mr. Jacobson. I am excited to be with you today. Today, we are now jumping over to the idea of imperialism and the rationales for them from 1750 to 1900. So, we're going to talk about imperialism. We're going to talk about old imperialism, new imperialism, or known as economic imperialism, and how things drastically change as a result. So let us begin. Okay, so the first wave of imperialism happens around 1450 to 1750. This is also known as the Age of Exploration, as we have covered previously. So this imperialism, this conquering of other countries is done through forceful means. Okay, so people are conquering other lands and building their overseas empires, like Spain, Portugal, but it's done through battle. It's done through conquest. It's done through means which are forceful. An example of that would be we have the Spanish who conquered the Aztecs and the Inca in the Americas, and therefore through that conquering, they now sort of dominate that region and all its resources. Another example could be the Portuguese when they began dominating the Indian Ocean after they won the Battle of Diu, which was against Indians and Muslims in that region. Now, the second wave of imperialism happens during the age of industrialization. So this is from 1750 to 1900. And instead of um, conquering and using forceful means, they became a little more softer their approach, yet very effective at their approach. Instead, they started dominating other countries through economic means, meaning that if you can control a country's economy to a large extent, then you have basically controlled the country by as well. So, because a country has to have an economy. So this becomes known as new imperialism or economic imperialism. An example of this would be the British East India Company. It will gradually conquer India through economic leverage that it places. So the more trading posts that they establish, the more power that they sort of secure for themselves, and then they start getting power within those areas that they're dominating to sort of collect taxes, and slowly the British East India Company, through a powerful economic engine, starts to dominate and control a country rather than just purely putting boots on the ground and fighting. All right, so we have the nationalist motives for imperialism. So nationalism plays a big part. As nations developed a strong sense of identity and loyalty to their state, to their government, many world powers boldly asserted authority over other territories. So we have a lot of building going on in Asia and in Africa as a way to prove their global dominance. We have Britain, France, and the Netherlands will emerge as the dominant imperialistic powers, and then later on we will have Germany and Italy will become unified within each of their countries and create a very strong sense of nationalism, and they too will begin their empire expansion somewhere in the mid-1880s. So this is what Great Britain is going to look like. All this red that's going on, this is the British Empire as it is between 1750 and by the end of 1900. This is what it kind of looks like. I'm sorry, by the end of 1800, this is what it looks like. So we have Australia, we have India, Ceylon, Burma, the Malay states, Borneo, and so as you can see, there's a lot of. It was said during that time period that the sun never set on the British Empire. And you can see why they said that and why it was true in essence, because their empire spans the whole globe. You got all the way from Australia to Canada. And so the sun never set on the British Empire, and again, it's that establishing of their dominance in these regions. And the way they showed their dominance was they had colonies that they created and that they controlled through economic means and for raw materials. So France is going to suffer a humiliating defeat from the Persian Empire. It's going to be known as the Franco-Prussian War. Okay, I said Persian, I'm sorry, Prussian Empire and the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. And once they do that, kind of like Britain, where Britain kind of got kicked out of North America after the Revolution, Britain's going to go ahead and start, paying more attention to Australia and paying a lot of attention to India. And France kind of does the same thing here. So France is gonna, start saying, okay, well, we're gonna stop trying to conquer Europe per se, and we're gonna start getting our raw materials elsewhere. And so they're going to continue their occupation of Algeria. They're gonna colonize New Caledonia, Senegal, and Indochina, which is modern day Vietnam, Laos region right in there. And of course, the Japanese are going to do their thing. So the Japanese, as a new modernized Japan, due to the Meiji Restoration and a desire to assert its nationalistic pride, Japan will begin its imperial expansion of East Asia. And as a result, they're going to conquer Korea. They're going to conquer Formosa, or modern-day Taiwan. And then they're going to conquer Manchuria, which is this region right here. And again, they want to conquer these areas because they want the land and the raw materials necessary to keep up and stay relevant in this highly competitive age of industrialization. So we have cultural motives for imperialism. So there's a few things I got to talk to you about, and this is pretty important to understand the mindset of the people this time, especially Western Europe. So Rudyard Kipling, who is also the author of a famous book called The Jungle Book, the story of Mowgli, and he befriends, animals, and Shere Khan's trying to kill him because he's a threat, he's a man. So he made that book, and it's a famous book. Disney obviously made adaptations of it. Well, he also wrote something called The White Man's Burden. And this poem that he kind of makes, here's an excerpt from it, but it sort of justifies Western Europeans' desire or actions to occupying other lands and going out and colonizing and being very imperialistic. So if you read over here, he says, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness, on fluttered fold and wild, your new caught stolen peoples, half devil and half child." And so the white man's burden is this attitude that Western Europe and eventually even America gets this notion that it's their duty to bring civility and civilization and modernization and Western culture to these other civilizations that are, in their mind, less civilized. And that's the white man's burden. The white man needs to bring and sacrifice and live in these colonies and bring westernized thoughts and education and views on politics and religion to them, and that's a burden they have to carry because it just has to happen, and it's fallen on the white man. And so anyway, we're not really sure if Rudyard Kipling really meant what he wrote or if it was more he was being sarcastic. Not really sure about that, but we do know one thing is that he wrote the White Man's Burden poem, which was used for justification. Another thing that justified the Europeans was a scientific belief that the cranium size of a Western European white male would be bigger than any other race. Thus, that would mean they're more intelligent. Now, it's not true, obviously, but that was a prevailing thought as well. Another prevailing thought, and a really important one that you need to click in your brain here, we have Charles Darwin, and he began the notion of the survival of the fittest. You're probably very familiar with this, the law of selection, right? Natural selection. So some people sort of adapted this notion into justifying imperialism on weaker nations. So they came up with this ideology known as social Darwinism. And it's the idea that the white man was is at the pinnacle of the evolutionary chart, and that all the other races in the world are somehow subpar to the white male evolution that they've achieved. So that was part of, and that kind of goes with the white man's burden, right? That they sort of believe that it's incumbent upon them, being a more superior race, to sort of have to give civility and civilization to the people who don't have it the way they have it. And so this is something that's also going to justify people of going out and taking over lands and robbing them of their raw materials, is this attitude of social Darwinism. So as a result, Western Europe believed it was their duty to westernize the inferior nations, teaching them Western language, education, political systems, religious institutions, manner of dress, etc. All right. Another thing, a motive they had was religious. So missionaries were among the most tireless at civilizing, with civilizing influences. So we're trying to civilize the world, right? And those missionaries really did a good job of sort of perpetuating it. So missionaries helped imperialism by convincing natives to abandon their traditional beliefs, like ancestral veneration, for example, and adopting Christianity. This paved the way for economic gains. Now, religions and humanitarian efforts were often combined when these missionaries would go out. And these missionaries, they wouldn't just, teach religion, but they'd build schools for religion and also secular learning. They'd provide medicine and medical care for natives. And we have a man by the name of David Livingstone, and he worked in sub-Saharan Africa to end the illegal slave trade. So there's a religious movement going on, and that's sort of perpetuating imperialism as well. We also have economic motives towards imperialism. So seeking to maximize profits, we have powerful trading companies chartered by the British, the French, the Dutch governments, signed commercial treaties with local rulers in India, East Africa, and East Indies. So we have very powerful trading companies, and they're kind of combined with the governments of where they come from, and they sort of striking deals with India, with East Africa, with the East Indies, and securing trade agreements. So things like Europeans would now have rights to build trading posts and forts to protect their interests. These companies even had like quasi-governmental powers, raising armies and conquering territory and to form colonies. A lot of these powerful trading companies will start emerging, and you'll know some of them as the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company. So British East India Company. It was granted by the British monarch in the 1600s to be able to be a company that deals with overseas trade. After driving the Portuguese out of India, remember the Portuguese were there first, they established the cotton and silk, indigo, and spice industry trade. Eventually, they're going to expand their influence into Persian Gulf, so they're going to expand it west of India as well. They became a major agent of imperialism in India, and after 1834, it became the British government's managing agency in India. So the British East India Company will actually become like the managing entity of the official British crown. We have this economic company that is tied with the government of Britain. In 1620, the East India Company engaged in slave trade, and also the East India Company participated in illegal transporting of opium to China in exchange for tea, and that will eventually lead to the Opium Wars. And we have the Dutch East India Company. So here we have the Dutch government. It gives the Dutch East India Company a monopoly on trade. They say, okay, go ahead. You get. Well, they said South Africa when they owned that for a little bit. The southern tip of South America, even they kind of had control of that. And Java, which is a big island in Indonesia. So the Dutch government sort of gave that as a monopoly trade to the Dutch East India Company. However, eventually we're going to see corruption and debt. It's going to lead to the Dutch government sort of taking over the company's possessions in 1799 and creating the Dutch East Indies, which is modern day Indonesia. And the Dutch will have control of Indonesia up into the mid 1900s. So that's it. Go ahead and ponder on these things. Write that one-page summary, and we'll see you when we come back. Thanks. Bye.